Chapter 1. Introduction. Overview of the Russian monarchy. The Russian monarchy is one of the longest and most complex forms of rule in Europe, with a history spanning almost 1,000 years. It began with the principalities of Kievan Rus in the 9th century, developed through the period of Mongol rule, the rise of Moscow and the Romanov dynasty, and finally ended with the overthrow of the last Tsar Nicholas II in 1917. The Russian monarchy was characterized by a close interplay between autocratic power, social hierarchy, expansion, and cultural development. Geographically, the Russian monarchy was unique. It stretched from the European borders of Russia to the Pacific Ocean and encompassed a variety of peoples, languages, and religions. This expansion made administration difficult, but at the same time required a flexible system of rule and control that integrated both local and central power structures. Politically, the monarchy was based on autocratic rule, in which the Tsar had unlimited power over the legislature, judiciary, and military. In contrast to many Western monarchies, in which parliaments or estates had influence, power in Russia was highly centralized. The social order was hierarchical, characterized by the nobility, clergy, bourgeoisie, and peasants, each of whom had different rights and duties. The Russian monarchy was not only a political institution, but also a social and cultural system that closely combined religion, tradition, and symbolism. The Orthodox Church played a central role, legitimizing the rule of the Tsar and shaping the moral and social understanding of the population. Art, architecture, literature, and music developed in close connection with the dynasties and reflected the political and ideological power of the ruler. The history of the Russian monarchy is at the same time a history of expansion and transformation. Starting from the Moscow Principality, Russian rule extended to Siberian, Caucasian, and Central Asian regions. At the same time, the internal development of the administration, military, and economy led to a modernization that made Russia a major European power. Reformers such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great tried to adopt Russia to Western standards without abandoning the autocratic structure. But the monarchy was also susceptible to crises and resistance. Dynastic conflicts, peasant uprisings, aristocratic opposition, and the growing political discontent of the 19th century ultimately led to the downfall of the Tsarist rule. The First World War exacerbated social tensions and accelerated the disintegration of the system, so that the February Revolution of 1917 sealed the end of the centuries-old monarchy. In summary, the Russian monarchy was a complex system of autocratic rule, social hierarchy, cultural imprint, and territorial expansion. It had a lasting impact not only on political structures, but also on Russia's cultural identity, social organization, and historical development. Understanding this monarchy is crucial to understanding Russia's dynamics, conflicts, and transformations from the Middle Ages to the beginning of the 20th century. In the next chapter, we will look at the emergence of Kievan Rus, 9th through 13th centuries, the earliest forms of monarchical rule, dynasties, trade routes, and the cultural imprint of the first Russian principalities. Chapter 2. The origin of Kievan Rus, 9th to 13th centuries. Kievan Rus is considered the first significant form of monarchical rule in the territory of present-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Originating in the 9th century, it was an association of Slavic tribes led by princes who relied on trade, military power, and dynastic alliances. Kievan Rus laid the foundation for political structures, cultural identity, and economic networks that would later form the backbone of the Russian monarchy. The origin of Kievan Rus is closely linked to the Varant movement. Scandinavian traders, warriors, and nobles, the so-called Varangians, established trade routes along the Dnieper, Volga, and Don rivers and established principalities that were both strategically and economically decisive. These routes enabled trade with Byzantium, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East, making Kiev an important political and economic center. Politically, Kievan Rus was characterized by a hierarchical rule of princes. At the top was the Grand Duke of Kiev, who ruled over the sub-princes of other cities.
This hierarchy was dynamic and often conflictual, as power struggles occurred frequently within the dynasty but also between different principalities. Dynastic marriages served not only to secure alliances, but also to legitimize political power. Kievan Rus was characterized by a strong trade orientation. Kiev was located at the crossroads of important trade routes between Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Orient. Products such as furs, wax, honey, grain, and slaves were traded over long distances, accumulating considerable wealth for the princes. But trade also meant diplomacy and military security. Control over rivers, cities, and trade routes was crucial for political stability and economic success. Culturally and religiously, Kievan Rus played a central role. Christianization under Vladimir the Great, 980–15, united the Kiev princes with Byzantium and led to the introduction of the Orthodox Church. This religion legitimized the rule of the princes, shaped art, architecture, and legal systems, and culturally linked the state to the Byzantine Empire. Churches, monasteries, and religious schools promoted both education and political stability, as religion was used as an instrument of social control. Militarily, Kievan Rus was characterized by the ability to defend and expand. The princes maintained standing troops consisting of Varangians, local fighters, and allied tribal warriors. These forces were used to secure trade routes, suppress insurgencies, and fight external threats, such as nomadic tribes or rival principalities. The military organization made a decisive contribution to Kiev remaining a stable core of power for centuries. Socially, Kievan Rus was shaped by tribal associations, nobility, traders, and peasants. Farmers formed the basis of the economy, while merchants ensured the prosperity of the cities. The nobility, consisting of princes, relatives, and military leaders, controlled land and resources, while the church served as a moral and social authority. This structure formed an early model that strongly influenced the later Russian monarchy: autocratic rule, social hierarchy, and close connection between state and religion. In summary, Kievan Rus was a dynamic, politically and economically networked state whose structure was characterized by dynastic rule, trade, military power, and religion. It laid the foundation for the later Russian monarchy by establishing central institutions, cultural imprints, and political practices that have been developed and transformed over centuries. In the next chapter, we will look at the Mongol period and the rule of the Golden Horde, 13th to 15th centuries, the impact of the invasion, tributes, political fragmentation, and cultural influences on the Russian monarchy.
Chapter 3. The Mongol period and the rule of the Golden Hordes, 13th to 15th centuries. The Mongol invasion of the 13th century represented one of the most profound incisions in the history of Kievan Rus and continues to shape the understanding of the Russian monarchy to this day. Between 1237 and 1240, the troops of Genghis Khan's successors invaded the Eastern European principalities and established the rule of the Golden Horde, a regional division of the Mongol Empire. The invasion led not only to military destruction, but also to political fragmentation, economic upheaval, and long-term social changes. Militarily, the Mongols were almost invincible. Their warfare was based on mobility, discipline, strategic intelligence, and psychological warfare. Cities that refused to pay tribute were often completely destroyed, leading to enormous population losses and refugee movements. Kiev, which had previously served as the center of Rus, was completely taken in 1240 and largely destroyed. This destruction initiated the decline of Kievan Rus as a political center and led to the shift of power to the northeast, especially to Moscow. The Mongols did not introduce a direct system of government, but established a tribute system that made the Russian princes dependent on the Golden Horde. These princes had to pay regular tributes to maintain their power and autonomy. At the same time, they received formal recognition as rulers from the Mongols, which paradoxically strengthened the position of the regional princes vis-à-vis local rivals. This system promoted the centralization of power in Moscow, where the princes were particularly adept at positioning themselves as mediators between the horde and the local nobles. Economically, Mongol rule led to changes in trade and agriculture. While cities in the south and west were severely weakened by war destruction, trade flourished again in some safe regions as the Mongols actively promoted trade over long stretches of the empire.
trade routes leading from Byzantium to Russia to Central Asia remained largely open under the control of the Horde, allowing for economic networking and the exchange of technologies and goods. Culturally and religiously, the Mongol period had both oppression and influence. The Orthodox Church played a central role, as it stabilized contact between the population and the princes and acted as a mediator with the Mongols. The Church was given extensive autonomy, was protected by the Horde, and was able to expand its influence in society. At the same time, the isolation from the European states led to a strengthening of specifically Russian cultural structures and traditions, which were later to be found in the Russian monarchy. Politically, Mongol rule brought about the fragmentation of the principalities. While Kiev and other Western cities lost importance, Moscow rose as a political center. The Moscow princes, including the famous Danilovich princes, used the tributary duties to expand their power base, forge alliances, and expand control over neighboring territories. This process laid the foundation for the centralization of power, which was systematized under Ivan III and later the Romanov dynasty. Socially, the Mongol period had a profound effect on the population. Many cities were destroyed, village communities depopulated, and serfdom increased in some regions as local princes sought to secure labor and pay tributes to the Horde. At the same time, new administrative and power structures emerged, which influenced the development of the autocratic system in Russia in the long term. In summary, it can be said that the Mongol period and the rule of the Golden Horde were a formative turning point for the Russian monarchy. They led to military destruction, political fragmentation, and economic upheaval, but also to a long-term centralization of power, the strengthening of the Orthodox Church, and the formation of a specifically Russian cultural identity. Moscow emerged from this period as the future center of the monarchy, which would later form the basis for the construction of a centralized Russian state under the Tsars. In the next chapter, we will examine the rise of Moscow and the centralization of power in the 15th to 16th centuries, the consolidation of principalities, the expansion of territory, and the establishment of centralized rule.
Chapter 4. The Rise of Moscow and the Centralization of Power, 15th, 16th centuries. After the decline of Kievan Rus and Mongol rule, Moscow began to rise to become a central center of power in the 15th century, which was to form the basis for the later Russian monarchy. Moscow benefited from its geographical location, the political skills of the princes, and the weakening of rival principalities. The period was marked by the consolidation of power, territorial expansion, and the centralization of political structures, which allowed Russia to form itself as an autocratic state. The Moscow princes, especially Ivan III, 1462 to 1505, played a decisive role in consolidation. Through skillful marriage alliances, military strength, and diplomatic negotiations, they succeeded in subordinating rival principalities and expanding Moscow's political authority. Ivan III took the title of Grand Duke of all Russians, which marked the symbolic centralization of power and established Moscow as Kiev's successor. Territorially, Moscow systematically expanded. Through military campaigns, diplomacy, and the subjugation of local princes, territories in the northwest, south, and east were integrated into the Moscow dominion. This expansion was not only militarily motivated, but also economically. New territories secured resources, trade routes, and agricultural land necessary for the consolidation of power. A central aspect of centralization was bureaucracy and administration. Ivan III and his successors developed a system of governors, officials, and local administrators that facilitated the collection of taxes, securing military services, and enforcing law and order. This administrative system laid the foundation for the autocratic state structure, which was later further expanded under Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. The Orthodox Church also played a key role. Moscow presented itself as the Third Rome, claiming the heritage of Byzantium and the central power over Russian Orthodoxy. The Church legitimized the rule of the Moscow princes, supported centralization, and created ideological foundations for the autocratic monarchy. At the same time, the Church used Moscow's stability to expand its influence in society and secure social control. Militarily, the Muscovite princes built up a standing army,
which was used both to subjugate the principalities and to defend against external threats, such as the Golden Horde and neighboring empires. This army combined traditional cavalry units with reorganized foot soldiers, allowing Moscow to secure its power base and assert its territorial claims. Socially and economically, Moscow benefited from the concentration of power and trade. Towns and villages were integrated into the central empire, taxes and duties were paid to the Moscow princes, and trade routes were consolidated under central control. Although the consolidation of the principalities led to repression by local elites, it also created stability that promoted trade, agriculture, and urban growth. In summary, the rise of Moscow and the centralization of power in the 15th and 16th centuries were decisive for the emergence of the Russian monarchy. Through skillful diplomacy, military expansion, bureaucratic reforms, and close cooperation with the Church, a centralized autocratic state emerged, paving the way for the eventual reign of Ivan IV and the consolidation of the Romanov dynasty. Moscow established itself as a political, cultural, and religious center that laid the foundation for modern Russia. In the next chapter, we will analyze the reign of Ivan the Terrible, the expansion of central power, the Oprichnina, political reforms, and the destruction of local resistance.
Chapter 5: The Reign of Ivan the Terrible, 1547 to 1584. The reign of Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, marked a turning point in the Russian monarchy. He was the first to officially award himself the title of Tsar of all Russians, which not only symbolized his absolute power, but also raised autocracy to a new, absolute level. Ivan IV combined political reforms, military expansion, and brutal repression to strengthen central power and finally consolidate the Russian state after centuries of fragmentation and foreign rule. Already at the beginning of his reign, Ivan tried to weaken the power of the noble families, the boyars, who had gained great influence during the Mongol period and the time of turmoil. He introduced a system of personal loyalty in which nobles were directly subordinate to the Tsar. At the same time, the central apparatus was strengthened, new administrative structures were created, and control over cities, fortresses, and key regions was expanded. A central element of his rule was the Oprichnina, 1565 to 1572, a radical instrument of political repression. Ivan divided the empire into two areas, one under the direct control of the Oprichnina, the other remained under traditional administration. The Oprichnina was characterized by a kind of personal secret police that systematically terrorized, expropriated, and executed nobles, wealthy merchants, and potential opponents. Cities were plundered, villages burned, and fear served to establish the Tsar as the sovereign ruler. This period was marked by state violence, terror, and the destruction of political resistance, but also laid the foundation for the Tsar's undisputed power over Russia. At the same time, Ivan IV pursued an expansive foreign policy. Under his rule, Russian territory was significantly expanded, especially eastwards into Siberian regions, through the subjugation of the khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. These conquests secured control over trade routes, resources, and strategically important areas. Militarily, Ivan relied on a combination of regular troops, militias of local princes, and new centralized weapon systems. Politically and administratively, Ivan also introduced reforms to standardize the judiciary and administration. He enacted new sets of laws that clearly defined the Tsar's rights over local princes and cities. These measures strengthened the central power, reduced regional autonomies, and made the administration more efficient, even if the brutal enforcement of the laws often led to social insecurity. Socially, his rule was ambivalent. On the one hand, cities, trade, and administration were strengthened, which brought advantages to the middle classes. On the other hand, the population suffered from the terrorist practices of the Oprichnina, forced resettlements, and military recruitment. Peasants and ordinary citizens had little protection from repression, while nobles had to navigate between loyalty and fear for their lives. Culturally, Ivan IV relied on the Orthodox Church and religious legitimacy to underpin his power. The Church supported him ideologically and helped to consolidate central power.
Church building, religious rituals, and the emphasis on divine legitimacy strengthened the image of the Tsar as an absolute ruler whose authority was sanctioned both politically and spiritually. To sum up, Ivan the Terrible's reign was a combination of expansive policies, centralizing reform, brutal repression, and religious legitimacy. The Oprichnina ensured the Tsar's power over everything and everyone, while territorial expansion, administration, and church laid the foundation for the further development of the Russian autocracy. Ivan IV left behind a Russia that was politically centralized, militarily strengthened, and shaped by the sovereign authority of the Tsar, a foundation on which the later Romanov dynasty could continue to build. In the next chapter, we will examine the period of turmoil, 1598 to 1613, dynastic crises, internal conflicts, Polish interventions, and the political challenges before the founding of the Romanov dynasty.
Chapter 6. The Time of Turmoil, 1598 to 1613. The time of turmoil was one of the most turbulent phases in the history of the Russian monarchy. It began with the death of Fyodor I in 1598, the last male Tsar of the Rurikid dynasty, and ended with the election of Mikhail Romanov in 1613. This period was marked by dynastic crises, internal conflicts, uprisings, foreign interventions, and widespread social instability. The events of this period had a lasting impact on Russia's political culture and prepared the ground for the establishment of the Romanov dynasty. With Fyodor's death, the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled the country since the beginnings of Kievan Rus, ended. Fyodor's succession was uncertain as he left no heirs, and Russia was plunged into a state of power vacuum. Various noble families, including the Bureaucrats and Romanovs, tried to secure the succession for themselves. At the same time, fake Dmitris appeared, people who claimed to be the murdered heir to the throne, Dmitri I, and received support from parts of the nobility and foreign powers. These figures led to political confusion and military conflicts throughout Russia. The time of turmoil was also characterized by social unrest and peasant revolts. The population suffered from the consequences of the Oprichnina, high taxes, crop failures, and general uncertainty. Peasants rebelled against local princes and nobles, which led to further military conflicts. Cities such as Moscow, Novgorod, and Pskov changed their rule several times, which severely affected economic and social stability. Foreign intervention played a decisive role, especially by Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. Poland took advantage of the dynastic uncertainty to send troops to Russia and gain influence over the succession to the throne. The Poles temporarily put their own candidate, the so-called Vladimir Dmitri, on the throne, which led to occupations and violent conflicts. Sweden, on the other hand, tried to secure influence in northwestern Russia, especially in regions like Novgorod. These interventions increased instability and led to protracted military conflicts. Despite the chaos phase, local centers of power also emerged during the turmoil, which tried to create order. Cities organized militias, noble families defended their territories, and regional leaders sought to restore control over trade and taxes. This decentralization was both a survival strategy and a precursor to the later Romanov policy, which combined central power with local involvement. Culturally and religiously, the time of turmoil was a phase of uncertainty and orientation. The Orthodox Church played a dual role. It conveyed stability and legitimate rule, but it also supported various candidates for the throne in order to secure its influence. At the same time, looting, war, and insecurity led to losses in education, art, and business, so that society as a whole suffered a setback. Finally, the time of turmoil ended with the election of Mikhail Romanov as Tsar in 1613. The decision was made by a Zemsky Sobor, a kind of national council of nobility and citizens. Mikhail was young, politically inexperienced, but he united the interests of various aristocratic factions and had the necessary support of the church. His election marked the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which was to rule Russia until 1917 and ushered in a period of stabilization, centralization, and restoration of the monarchy. In summary, the period of turmoil was a phase of dynastic uncertainty, social unrest, and foreign intervention, which plunged Russia into an existential crisis.
At the same time, it laid the foundations for later consolidation under the Romanovs, strengthened the importance of central power structures, and showed the need for a strong autocratic Tsar to ensure territorial unity, political order, and social stability. In the next chapter, we will examine the founding and consolidation of the Romanov dynasty, 1613 to 1725, how the new dynasty established order, established the Tsar as the sovereign ruler, and laid the foundation for modern Russia.
Chapter 7. The Romanov Dynasty, 1613 to 1725. The election of Mikhail Romanov in 1613 marked the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for 3 centuries. After decades of instability during the period of turmoil, Russia needed a dynastic order that could ensure both political stability and the central authority of the Tsar. The Romanovs initially established themselves cautiously, but their skill in diplomacy, administration, and military organization laid the foundation for the later establishment of an autocratic central state. At the beginning of their rule, the Romanovs faced enormous challenges. Russia was politically fragmented, economically weakened, and militarily vulnerable. The power of the local princes and nobles was great. The Orthodox Church had its own influence, and numerous cities were still suffering from the consequences of looting and wars. Mikhail Romanov and his successors therefore began to systematically build centralized structures that extended the Tsar's influence over the entire territory. A decisive step was the strengthening of bureaucracy. Administration, tax collection, the judiciary, and military organization were increasingly standardized. The Tsar's court controlled regional governors, who in turn involved or replaced local princes. This system made it possible to mobilize resources, coordinate military formations, and suppress insurgencies at an early stage. At the same time, a professional, centrally controlled army began to emerge, less dependent on local nobles and directly subordinate to the Tsar. The Romanovs also relied on dynastic legitimacy and close ties to the Orthodox Church. The Church supported the rule of the new dynasty ideologically and helped to secure the loyalty of the population. Mikhail Romanov and his successors understood that religion not only conveyed spiritual power, but was also a political instrument to consolidate autocratic rule. Churches, monasteries, and religious ceremonies served to symbolize the Tsar's presence in all areas of society. Territorial expansion was another characteristic of the early Romanov rule. Under Mikhail Romanov and his son Alexei I, the conquest of Siberia and the Far East began, giving Russia access to raw materials, trade routes, and strategically important areas. Military campaigns, diplomacy with local tribes, and the integration of new territories into the administrative network of the Romanovs made it possible to create a continuous, centralized dominion that laid the foundation for the later Tsarist states. Economically, the Romanovs consolidated the country through tax reforms, promotion of trade, and agriculture. Serfdom was formalized to secure the workforce for the expanding army, infrastructure projects, and the state apparatus. Cities and commercial centers have been promoted, while at the same time, control over rural areas and resources has been expanded. This combination of economic use and centralized administration contributed decisively to the stabilization of Russia. Culturally, the Romanovs promoted the Orthodox Church, education, and crafts, while still allowing the influence of Western ideas to a limited extent. The combination of religious legitimation, dynastic authority, and cultural symbolism created a consistent image of rule. The Tsar as a divinely sanctioned ruler, the Church as moral support, and administration as an instrument of order and control. Territorial expansion was another characteristic of the early Romanov rule. Under Mikhail Romanov and his son Alexei I, the conquest of Siberia and the Far East began, giving Russia access to raw materials, trade routes, and strategically important areas. Military campaigns, diplomacy with local tribes, and the integration of new territories into the administrative network of the Romanovs made it possible to create a continuous, centralized dominion that laid the foundation for the later Tsarist states. Economically, the Romanovs consolidated the country through tax reforms, promotion of trade, and agriculture. Serfdom was formalized to secure the workforce for the expanding army, infrastructure projects, and the state apparatus.
Cities and commercial centers have been promoted, while at the same time, control over rural areas and resources has been expanded. This combination of economic use and centralized administration contributed decisively to the stabilization of Russia. Culturally, the Romanovs promoted the Orthodox Church, education, and crafts, while still allowing the influence of Western ideas to a limited extent. The combination of religious legitimation, dynastic authority, and cultural symbolism created a consistent image of rule. The Tsar as a divinely sanctioned ruler, the Church as moral support, and administration as an instrument of order and control. To sum up, the Romanovs consolidated Russia after decades of instability, creating centralized administrative structures, a standing army, territorial expansion, and economic stability. The dynasty used religion, dynastic politics, and bureaucracy to legitimize its rule, laying the foundations for the autocratic system that was fully developed under Peter the Great and later Tsar. The Romanovs established Russia as a strong, centralized state that expanded both territorially and politically, shaping the identity of an imperial power. In the next chapter, we will examine the reforms and strategies of rule of Peter the Great, 1682 to 1725, modernization, military reforms, European orientation, and the expansion of central power.
Chapter 8. Peter the Great, 1682 to 1725. The reign of Peter the Great marks a turning point in Russian history. Peter I pursued the goal of making Russia a modern, European state by introducing military, administrative, economic, and cultural reforms. At the same time, he consolidated the autocratic power of the Tsar and developed Russia into a great power with influence in Europe. Peter was appointed Tsar in 1682 together with his half-brother Ivan V, but de facto took over sole rule from 1696. He was convinced that Russia's progress and power could only be achieved through modernization, according to the Western model. At the beginning of his reign, he traveled incognito to Europe on the so-called Great Legation, 1697 to 1698. There he studied shipbuilding, military engineering, administration, and trade organization. He brought this knowledge back to Russia in order to fundamentally reform the country. A central aspect was military reform. Peter modernized the army by training according to European standards, introducing new tactics, modern weapons, and a standing fleet. The Russian Navy was founded, which was decisive for Russia's military positioning on the Baltic Sea and later on the Black Sea. These reforms enabled Russia to defeat Sweden in the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, and conquer the Baltic coast as well as strategic cities such as St. Petersburg. Peter also introduced far-reaching administrative and bureaucratic reforms. He replaced traditional administration with specialized ministries and colleges, standardized tax collection, centrally administered trade and economic policy, and introduced new rankings based on years of service and performance. The Tsarina or Tsar was thus able to centralize power and strengthen control over distant provinces. On the economic level, Peter focused on industrialization and trade promotion. Factories, manufactories, and mines were organized according to the Western model, and craftsmanship and innovation were promoted. The founding of new cities, especially St. Petersburg in 1703, was intended to facilitate access to Europe, promote trade, and symbolically present Russia as a European great power. Social and cultural reforms also shaped his rule. Peter introduced a strict dress code to disseminate European clothing, obligated the nobility to serve in the military, and modernized the education system. Universities and academies were founded to impart knowledge in technology, mathematics, shipping, and engineering. At the same time, he introduced censorship to control opposition and strengthened the Tsar's influence over the Orthodox Church, tying religious authority to central power. Peter often brutally enforced his reforms. Resistance was suppressed, traditional power structures of the nobility and the church were restricted, and coercive measures ensured the implementation of his projects. Despite this harshness, he modernized Russia economically, militarily, and administratively, and established an order that laid the foundation for the modern Russian Empire.
To sum up, Peter the Great was the architect of Russia's modernization, strengthening the Tsar's autocratic power, building military strength, reforming administration, and implementing Western cultural and economic standards. Under his rule, Russia became a great power whose influence extended far beyond Eastern Europe. At the same time, Peter laid the foundation for later tensions between autocratic power and social groups that viewed his authoritarian methods critically. In the next chapter, we will look at the reign of Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796. Ideas of the Enlightenment, domestic reforms, expansion, and the consolidation of the Tsarist Empire.
Chapter 9. Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796. The reign of Catherine the Great is one of the formative epochs of the Russian monarchy. Catherine II, a German princess who became Tsarina by marriage, took power in 1762 after a coup d'état against her husband Peter III. It knew how to ensure political stability, consolidate autocracy, and, at the same time, expand Russia culturally, economically, and territorially. Her reign was marked by a combination of Enlightenment ideals, pragmatic politics, and imperial expansion. A central focus of their rule was domestic politics. Katerina promoted the modernization of the administration in order to strengthen the central power. Provinces were divided into governorates, local administrative structures were reformed, and taxes and jurisdiction were organized more efficiently. It understood that a functioning state must be strong not only militarily but also bureaucratically, and implemented reforms that secured the Tsar's power against local nobles and regional elites. Katerina was strongly influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, especially philosophers such as Voltaire and Diderot. It initiated educational reforms, founded schools and academies, promoted science and art, and expanded libraries and collections. At the same time, it was aware of autocratic power and used the Enlightenment more as an instrument of legitimacy to carry out reforms that benefited the state and the dynasty, not necessarily to introduce democratic principles. Another characteristic of their rule was the expansion of the territory. Catherine waged successful wars against the Ottoman Empire, gained the Crimea, parts of today's southern Russia, and the Black Sea. It consolidated Russia's presence in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe and integrated areas of strategic, economic, and military importance. Through this expansion, Russia became a recognized European great power with access to important sea routes and trade routes. Catherine also reformed the legal system, and, in 1767, she had a code of laws prepared to standardize modernized jurisdiction and administration. Although the code was never fully implemented, it symbolized their pursuit of rational governance and legal certainty. She understood that legal reforms could legitimize rule, strengthen bureaucracy, and promote social stability. Socially, Katerina stood between the Enlightenment and tradition. It promoted education, art, and science, but strengthened serfdom in order to secure the nobility as a pillar of the monarchy. Peasant uprisings, such as the famous uprising of the Pugachev rebels, 1773 to 1775, were brutally suppressed. Katerina thus showed that reform and enlightenment did not go hand in hand with social equality, but had to secure the power of the Tsar. Culturally, Katerina focused on Russification and European orientation. St. Petersburg was strengthened as a cultural center. Theaters, academies, and palaces were promoted. She maintained correspondence with European intellectuals and positioned Russia as a part of the European Enlightenment circle, while at the same time consolidating national identity and orthodoxy in the administration. To sum up, Catherine the Great uniquely combined Enlightenment ideals, autocratic power, and territorial expansion. It modernized administration, law, and culture, consolidated the central power of the Tsar, and made Russia a recognized European great power. At the same time, it preserved social hierarchies, suppressed uprisings, and used reforms primarily to secure the dynasty and central rule. Their rule shows the ability to combine autocracy with modernization, which stabilized the Russian monarchy at its peak in the 18th century. In the next chapter, we will analyze the society and estates in the Russian monarchy,
nobility, peasants, clergy, urban population, and the social hierarchy that formed the foundation of power, economy, and culture.
Chapter 10: Society and Estates in the Russian Monarchy. For centuries, the society of the Russian monarchy was characterized by strict hierarchies, social differentiation, and political dependencies. From the early principalities of Kievan Rus through the Romanov dynasty to the reforms of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, Russia's social structure was increasingly formalized, with power, property, and political rights closely intertwined. At the top was the Tsar, whose power was absolute. The Tsar was regarded as a divinely legitimized ruler whose authority over legislation, administration, military, and religion was unchallenged. The Tsar's position was not only political, but also symbolic, as he was seen as the center of society's order, wealth, and moral legitimacy. Directly under the Tsar stood the aristocratic class, consisting of boyars, counts, and princes. The nobility was the bearer of political and economic power and provided the bureaucracy, officer corps, and advisors to the Tsar. Under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, the nobility was more closely involved in the civil service by being obliged to take on military or administrative tasks. In return, they received land, titles, and political privileges. This combination of service and status was a central element of autocracy, as it tied loyalty to central power. The peasantry formed a largest population group and was the economic basis of the empire. Since the 16th century, serfdom has been increasingly institutionalized, especially under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Farmers were tied to land, had to pay taxes, and do forced labor. These regulations secured income for the nobles and at the same time the resource basis for the central power. Peasant uprisings, such as that of Pugachev, 1773 to 1775, showed the tensions that existed between autocracy, nobility, and oppressed population. Another important class was the clergy, especially the Orthodox Church. It served as a moral and religious pillar of the monarchy, legitimized the Tsar's throne, and conveyed social norms. Church and state were closely intertwined, with the church ensuring the loyalty of the population to the Tsar and at the same time influencing education, law, and welfare. Under Peter the Great, the church was more closely tied to the state, for example through the founding of the Holy Synod, which reformed the church administration and placed it directly under the Tsar's control. The urban population was made up of craftsmen, merchants, civil servants, and citizens. In cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Novgorod, trading centers and administrative nests were created, which drove economic development. From the 18th century onwards, bourgeois classes gained increasing importance, especially through trade, crafts, and administration. However, they were highly regulated, subject to high taxes, and had only limited political say. Society was thus strictly hierarchically structured, with the Tsar at the top, the nobility as the administrative elite, the church as ideological support, the peasantry as the economic basis, and the urban population as the economic and administrative middle class. This hierarchy was secured by legal regulations, social norms, and coercive systems. Culturally, the social order was reflected in education, clothing, architecture, and ceremonies. The nobility increasingly oriented themselves towards European standards, while farmers and urban populations preserved traditional ways of life. The social hierarchy became visible and stabilized through clothing, housing, language, and access to education, symbolically and practically manifesting the power of the Tsar at all levels of society. In summary, the society of the Russian monarchy was strongly hierarchical, organized according to estates, and characterized by autocratic power. The combination of nobility, bureaucracy, military, church, and peasantry formed the foundation of the monarchy. This social structure allowed for political stability, economic production, and cultural continuity, but at the same time provided the basis for tensions and resistance that were repeatedly evident in later reforms and uprisings. In the next chapter, we will analyze the economic foundations and agriculture of the Russian monarchy, the role of serfdom, trade, crafts, and the economic basis of power. Chapter 11: Economic Fundamentals and Agriculture.
For centuries, the economic basis of the Russian monarchy was closely linked to agriculture and the use of labor, with serfdom being the central instrument for securing production and resources for the state and nobility. While cities and trade played a growing role, agriculture and land formed the foundation for the political and social stability of the Tsarist Empire. The majority of the population consisted of peasants who were tied to the land and were under serfdom. They had to pay taxes to their landlords, perform forced labor, and were often under the direct control of the nobility or the state. Serfdom was more pronounced in Russia than in many Western European countries, as it supported not only economic production but also the political hierarchy. Peasant uprisings, such as that of the Pugachev Rebellion, showed, however, that this dependence caused social tensions. Agriculture itself was predominantly subsistence-oriented, even though certain regions specialized in export products. Cereals, meat, dairy products, and flax were among the main yields. In fertile regions, especially in the European part of Russia, larger estates were created, which secured wealth for the nobility and the state. The state intervened to reduce crop failures, secure taxes, and provide food for cities and the army. In addition to agriculture, crafts and urban production also played a growing role. In cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, Novgorod, or Arkhangelsk, workshops, manufactories, and small factories were established in which textiles, metal goods, weapons, and luxury goods were produced. This production was often closely linked to the needs of the court and the army, which meant that the economy and the military were closely interlinked. Under Peter the Great, these economic structures were deliberately modernized in order to integrate Russia more closely into European trade and industrialization. Another important area was domestic trade and long-distance trade. Russia exported grain, furs, wood, and other raw materials to Europe, and imported metal goods, weapons, luxury goods, and technology. However, trade and infrastructure were heavily regulated by the central authorities. Roads, rivers, and later canals served to control trade routes, mobilize resources, and secure tax revenues. The use of resources was closely linked to state control and military power. Raw materials such as iron, salt, wood, furs, and later coal were systematically exploited, with the state and the nobility supervising production. These resources were crucial to the military strength, trade, and stability of the Tsarist Empire. The economic structure was strongly hierarchically organized. Peasants formed the basis, the nobility the controlling and organizing class, urban craftsmen and merchants acted as intermediaries between production and the market, while the state retained overall control through taxes, monopolies, and bureaucracy. This order allowed the Tsar to use economic resources specifically for administration, military, and expansion. To sum up, the economy of the Russian monarchy was based on agriculture, serfdom, controlled trade, and the targeted use of resources. These structures enabled political stability and the financing of the administration and military, but also generated social tensions, especially among the peasantry. Economy, power, and society were closely intertwined, so that economic control directly meant political and social control. In the next chapter, we will analyze the military and expansionist policies of the Russian monarchy, from territorial conquests and army reform to securing Russia's borders and influence in Europe and Asia. Chapter 12. Military and Expansion. From the very beginning, the Russian monarchy was an expansive power whose territory continuously expanded over centuries. Military and expansion were closely linked, as the Tsars used the army and navy to secure control over newly gained territories, protect trade and resources, and expand Russia's political dominance in both Europe and Asia. The army played a central role in the structure of rule. Under the early Romanovs, the military organization was reformed to replace independent princes and local militias and to place troops directly under the Tsar. Peter the Great took this development to a new level. He modernized the army according to European standards, introduced regular units, specialized regiments, and new tactics. At the same time, he built up the Russian Navy, which made Russia a maritime power for the first time and secured access to the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. The expansion was territorially and strategically motivated. Russia expanded eastwards into Siberia, the Far East, and Central Asia, making new resources such as furs, timber, grains, and later mining products accessible. At the same time, Russia secured its borders against the Mongols, Tatars, and later against the Ottoman Empire. In the West, expansion led to the acquisition of the Baltic coast, the Baltic territory, and participation in European conflicts, such as the Great Northern War against Sweden, which consolidated Russia's rise to become a European great power. In addition to military strength, the administration of newly conquered territories was decisive. Russia used governors, military commanders, and administrative officials to ensure control and order. Local rulers or tribal leaders were often integrated into the system, but were given limited autonomy to secure central authority. This method allowed for flexible expansion, as military conquest and political integration went hand in hand. The military expansion also had social and economic effects. Peasants were forced into the service of the army, craftsmen and merchants had to provide military supplies and infrastructure, and new areas had to be opened up and made economically viable. Cities such as St. Petersburg, Kronstadt, or Orenburg emerged as military and administrative centers and combined strategic control with economic use. Military power and expansion were also ideologically legitimized. Tsarist rule presented itself as divinely legitimized, while expansion was justified as protecting orthodoxy, securing borders, and expanding Russian influence. This combination of military strength, territorial expansion, and ideological legitimacy consolidated the autocratic structure of the state and increased the Tsars' political room for maneuver. In summary, the military and expansion were central pillars of the Russian monarchy. They made it possible to expand territory, control resources, secure borders, and build an autocratic state with centralized power. At the same time, they had profound social, economic, and cultural consequences, as new territories had to be integrated, labor mobilized, and political loyalty secured. This development prepared Russia for its role as a European and Eurasian great power. In the next chapter, we will examine the politics, administration, and bureaucracy of the Russian monarchy, how Tsars used bureaucracy to centralize power, collect taxes, and control the vast territory.
Chapter 13: Politics, Administration, and Bureaucracy. The Russian monarchy was characterized by a strong, centralized autocratic system based on the direct influence of the Tsar and a growing bureaucracy. Politics, administration, and bureaucracy were closely intertwined and served to control Russia's vast territory, collect taxes, enforce laws, and efficiently implement military and economic goals. At the top was the Tsar, who had unlimited power over the legislature, the judiciary, and the military. Under his authority functioned the central institutions of the state, whose task was to enforce rule in a country that stretched across Europe, Siberia, and parts of Central Asia. The Tsar could issue rules, appoint officers, and carry out administrative reforms through decrees, ukase, making his power felt in all areas. The administration was increasingly formalized. Under Peter the Great, colleges were created, specialized administrative units that dealt with individual areas such as finance, war, justice, trade, and communication. These reforms replaced old, inefficient structures and allowed for a professional, centralized administration that operated independently of local noble families. Later, under Catherine the Great, the administration was further standardized. Provinces, governorates, were organized and governors were appointed who were directly subordinate to the Tsar. The bureaucracy was hierarchical. At the bottom were civil servants in towns and villages who were supposed to collect taxes, enforce laws, and prevent riots. These employees were the interface between the central power and the population. Their loyalty to the Tsar was crucial, as local elites often pursued their own interests. Through clear hierarchies, official duties, and strict control, the central power was able to secure its power even in remote regions. Another important aspect was the legal system. Peter the Great initiated new sets of laws and reforms that regulated administration, taxes, military service, and property rights. Catherine the Great also prepared a code of laws that was to unify modernized jurisdiction and administration.
The implementation of law was not only a means of order, but also an instrument of power consolidation in order to strengthen the Tsar's influence over local princes and the nobility. Politics and bureaucracy were also closely linked to the Orthodox Church. The Church legitimized the rule of the Tsar, imparted social norms, and controlled education and morality. Under Peter the Great, the Holy Synod was founded to subordinate the Church directly to the state, while Catherine used the Church to ensure social stability and carry out reforms. The combination of bureaucracy and religion created an effective system of control that guaranteed both economic and social stability. The administration was also a tool for mobilizing resources. Taxes, duties, military recruitment, and agricultural production were organized by the bureaucracy to meet the needs of the army, court, and infrastructure projects. This control was central to the expansion of the Russian Empire, the modernization of the economy, and the safeguarding of territorial integrity. In summary, politics, administration, and bureaucracy formed the backbone of the Russian monarchy. They allowed control over a vast territory, the enforcement of law and order, the mobilization of resources, and the stabilization of autocratic rule. Through hierarchical structures, centralization, and close ties with the church and military, the Tsar was able to exercise his power effectively at all levels of society. In the next chapter, we will analyze the cultural development, science, and education of the Russian monarchy, how art, literature, universities, and academies strengthened the power of the Tsar and influenced Russia in Europe.
Chapter 14: Cultural Development, Science, and Education. The Russian monarchy was not only strongly influenced politically and militarily, but also developed over the centuries into a cultural and intellectual center that was strongly intertwined with European developments in science, art, and education. The Tsars used culture as an instrument of power, as a means of legitimizing their rule and modernizing the country, while at the same time forming an independent Russian identity. Under Peter the Great, a far-reaching modernization push began. He brought Western scientists, engineers, and teachers to Russia and promoted the establishment of academies and universities to impart technical, military, and administrative knowledge. The St. Petersburg Academy of Arts and the Imperial Academy of Sciences were established to establish research and teaching according to European standards. At the same time, printing houses were promoted, books were produced, and access to Western knowledge was facilitated. Catherine the Great continued this development. It introduced educational reforms, founded schools for girls and boys, promoted grammar schools, and the study of science, mathematics, philosophy, and law. She maintained close contacts with European intellectuals such as Voltaire and Diderot, conducted academic correspondence, and used their ideas to legitimize reforms in administration and law. Education thus became a means of making the state more efficient, but also of swearing the elite to centralized rule. Culturally, a flourishing art and literature scene developed under the Tsars. Architecture, painting, theater, and music were promoted by state patronage. St. Petersburg became a cultural center of Europe, with magnificent palaces, theaters, and museums. At the same time, traditional Russian forms of expression, such as icon painting, folk music, and literature, were cultivated and sometimes merged with European influences, creating a hybrid culture that combined Russian identity and European modernity. The Orthodox Church also played a role here. It was not only a religious institution, but also a promoter of education and the arts, especially in the education of clergy, civil servants, and higher society. Schools, libraries, and monasteries served both religious and secular education, which at the same time morally and ideologically aligned the cultural elite with the Tsarist rule. Another element was the promotion of science and technology. Russian engineers, cartographers, medics, and military technicians have been trained to support infrastructure projects, military modernization, and economic development. The expansion of roads, ports, canals, and fortresses required a close interlocking of knowledge, administration, and military organization. Science and education were thus directly linked to state power and expansion. In summary, culture, science, and education were not only expressions of wealth and prestige in the Russian monarchy, but also strategic tools for consolidating power, modernizing administration, and committing society to autocratic rule.
In the next chapter, we will examine the role of religion and church in the Russian monarchy, how the Orthodox Church legitimized power, promoted education, and ensured social stability.
Chapter 15. Religion and Church in the Russian Monarchy. The Orthodox Church was a central pillar of the Russian monarchy for centuries. It was not only a spiritual institution, but also a political and social instrument that legitimized the rule of the Tsar, conveyed social norms, and acted as a link between the state and the population. The close interlocking of church and autocracy had a lasting impact on Russia's political system, culture, and social order. Christianity was already introduced under Kievan Rus under Vladimir the Great, 980–15, and played a central role from then on. With the centralization under the Moscow princes and later under the Romanovs, orthodoxy gained an institutionalized position of power, which was not only religiously but also politically decisive. The church supported the dynasty, legitimized the Tsar's throne through divine order, and conveyed social values that supported autocracy. Under Peter the Great, the relationship between church and state was redefined. He eliminated the independence of the Patriarchate and replaced it with the Holy Synod, a state college that brought the administration of the church under Tsarist control. Thus, the Tsar could directly influence church affairs, appoint clergymen, and use the church to support administration, law, and the military. Orthodoxy continued to be a moral and ideological support, but was used more strongly as an instrument of central power. Catherine the Great also cleverly used the church to consolidate her autocratic rule. It strengthened Orthodox educational institutions, schools, and monasteries in order to secure the loyalty of the population. At the same time, it used the church to implement reformist ideas of the Enlightenment, for example, by educating priests who brought knowledge and morals to the villages, and by promoting school education in connection with religious instruction. The church was not only an ideological support, but also an economic power factor. Monasteries owned land, levied taxes, carried out crafts and agriculture, and played an important role in social welfare. They were often the only institutions that could provide education, medical care, and social control in remote areas. As a result, the church was closely linked to the functioning of the state and the stabilization of society. Religious rituals, festivals, and architecture also served to symbolize the power of the Tsar. Churches, cathedrals, and religious ceremonies illustrated the divine legitimacy of autocracy. The Tsar appeared not only as a political ruler, but as a morally and spiritually sanctioned ruler whose decisions corresponded to divine order. Orthodoxy also had a socially stabilizing effect by conveying a collective identity and moral order. It regulated behavior, imparted norms, and offered rituals that held society together in times of political or economic uncertainty. At the same time, it remained a medium for control, as resistance to the Tsar was often interpreted as a violation of divine order. In summary, religion and church were inseparable from the autocratic power of the Tsar in the Russian monarchy. The Orthodox Church legitimized the throne, stabilized social structures, supported administration and education, and imparted values that secured central authority. By combining faith, morality, and political power, the monarchy was supported at all levels of society, and control over Russia's vast territory was secured. In the next chapter, we will examine the uprisings and opposition, peasant rebels, aristocratic opposition, reform movements, and political challenges that repeatedly tested the autocratic system. Chapter 16. Uprisings and Opposition. Despite the autocratic power of the Tsar and the close interlocking of the church, administration, and military, the Russian monarchy was never free of uprisings and opposition. These tensions resulted from social inequalities, economic strain, political oppression, and cultural tensions. Peasant uprisings, aristocratic opposition, and reformist movements contributed to the fact that the Tsarist rule was repeatedly tested and occasionally challenged. The greatest social tension arose in the rural territory, where the majority of the population lived. Serfdom tied peasants to the land, forced them to pay taxes and forced labor, and made them extremely dependent on nobles and state authorities.
This led to regular peasant uprisings, the most famous of which was the Pugachev Uprising, 1773 to 1775 under Catherine the Great. Yermak Timofeyevich in Siberia and other local uprisings showed that oppression, high taxes, and forced labor often met with massive resistance. The nobility also occasionally questioned the power of the Tsar. Despite the privileges and the integration into military or administrative structures, conspiracies, mutinies, and intrigues occurred again and again. Especially under weaker rulers or in transitional periods, such as after the death of Peter the Great or in the succession arrangements during Catherine's rise, noble factions tried to influence the succession to the throne or to assert their own interests. From the 18th century onwards, reformist and intellectual oppositions arose in urban areas. Academics, writers, and civil servants criticized inefficient administration, corruption, and social injustice. Although this opposition was often limited and highly controlled, it formed the breeding ground for later liberal movements and political reforms. Education and science thus became not only means of stabilization, but also platforms for critical thinking. Another important aspect was the national and ethnic tension within the multi-ethnic empire. For centuries, Russia controlled various ethnic groups, including Tatars, Finns, Ukrainians, Poles, and Caucasian tribes. Many of these groups resisted forced integration, taxes, and military recruitment. This resistance led to uprisings, guerrilla wars, and regional instability, which had to be crushed again and again by the central power. The Tsars usually responded to uprisings with a combination of repression and reform. Peasant uprisings were often brutally suppressed, while at the same time administrative measures were introduced to ensure long-term stability. Noble conspiracies were controlled through surveillance, loyalty checks, and punishment. Reforms under Catherine the Great or Alexander I were aimed at integrating the elite and population into the system and reducing social tensions. Despite these repressions, uprisings and oppositions showed that autocratic rule was constantly dependent on resistance to secure its legitimacy. Each crisis led to an adjustment of the power structures, be it through greater bureaucratization, targeted reforms, or the use of ideology, religion, and culture for stabilization. In summary, uprisings and opposition were an integral part of the Russian monarchy. They reflected social inequalities, economic burdens, and political tensions, repeatedly questioned the power of the Tsar, and forced the monarchy to develop mechanisms of control, repression, and reform. This dynamic contributed to the fact that the Russian autocracy, while strong, remained vulnerable to social and political crises. In the next chapter, we will analyze the Russian monarchy in the 19th century, reforms, oppression, social changes, and the challenges of modernity that prepared the empire for the revolutions of the 20th century.
Chapter 17: The Russian Monarchy in the 19th Century. The 19th century presented the Russian monarchy with enormous challenges. Economic modernization, social tensions, political reforms, and international conflicts characterized this era. The Tsars had to master the balancing act between autocratic power and the growing demands on administration, the economy, and society in order to maintain the stability of the empire. At the beginning of the century, Alexander I, 1801 to 1825, ruled, whose reign was initially characterized by reforms and a European orientation. Alexander relied on education, administration, and military modernization to integrate Russia into the circle of European great powers. At the same time, he remained an autocratic ruler who deliberately used reforms to strengthen central power. Under his leadership, Russia played a decisive role in the Napoleonic Wars, which brought both military successes and economic burdens. After Alexander I, Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855, took over the reign. He pursued a reactionary policy that strengthened Tsarist power and limited reforms. Nicholas relied on strict surveillance, censorship, secret police, Cheka precursors, and military control to suppress resistance. His rule was marked by political repression aimed at curbing the growing unrest caused by social inequalities and economic strains. Social tensions determined the century.
serfdom remained a central instrument for securing economic stability and the income of the nobility. At the same time, discontent among peasants grew, leading to uprisings, refugee movements, and local revolts in certain regions. Cities grew, merchants and craftsmen formed an increasingly self-confident bourgeois class that strived for the right to have a say. These social developments forced the Tsars to take reformist measures, which, however, were always implemented within the framework of autocratic control. Economically, Russia began to industrialize more strongly. Railways, manufactures, and new production methods spread, especially under Alexander II, who later initiated a series of economic reforms. The development of transport infrastructure, trade, and industry was closely linked to military and administrative goals, as a strong economic foundation was necessary to secure the territorial and military interests of the empire. Culturally and intellectually, the educational and scientific offerings grew, which led to the emergence of a critically thinking elite. Universities, scientific academies, and literary circles promoted discussions about reform, autocracy, social justice, and Russia's role in Europe. This intellectual movement was an early nucleus for the later political and revolutionary currents that shook the Tsarist Empire in the 20th century. Internationally, Russia continued to play a central role. The war against Napoleon had underlined Russia's military strength and diplomatic importance. At the same time, the growing influence in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus region, and Central Asia led to conflicts with the Ottoman Empire, Persia, Great Britain, and later France. The expansion and securing of zones of influence was a central aspect of politics, requiring both military power and administrative efficiency. In summary, the 19th century was a phase of confrontation between autocracy and modernization. The Russian monarchy had to cope with political repression, social tensions, economic changes, and international challenges. While reforms such as the modernization of administration, education, and infrastructure were implemented, the Tsar's rule remained centralized and autocratic. The tensions of this century prepared the empire for the great upheavals of the 20th century, especially the revolutionary movements that would eventually overthrow the monarchy. In the next chapter, we will discuss the reforms of Alexander II, analyze in detail peasant liberation, judicial reforms, economic modernization, and the attempts to stabilize the autocratic system in the modern context.
Chapter 18. Reforms of Alexander II. The reign of Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, was characterized by a unique combination of autocratic power and comprehensive reform efforts aimed at modernizing Russian society, economy, and administration without endangering the central power of the Tsar. At a time of rising social tensions, military defeats, and economic backwardness, Alexander recognized the need to introduce reforms to stabilize the empire in the long term while securing autocracy. One of the most important reforms was the peasants' liberation of 1861. Serfdom had dominated Russian agriculture for centuries, placing a heavy burden on the population and promoting social tensions. With the reform, around 23 million farmers were formally free, given personal rights, access to land, and the opportunity to make their own economic decisions. However, the implementation was complex. The farmers had to pay compensation to their former landlords, land was partly distributed in inefficient plots, and control over the communities remained partially intact. Despite these limitations, the reform marked a historic turning point as it ended feudal dependence and laid the foundation for economic and social mobility. In addition to the liberation of the peasants, judicial reforms were carried out to modernize the legal system and make it fairer. The reforms led to the introduction of judicial independence, jury trials, public trials, and uniform legislation. They were intended to reduce corruption, increase legal certainty, and strengthen the acceptance of the state among the population. The reforms showed that the Tsar was willing to adapt traditional structures without relinquishing his autocratic authority. The local government was also reformed. Alexander introduced the so-called zemstvos, local self-governing bodies at the county level, which were responsible for infrastructure, education, and social issues.
These institutions allowed for partial participation of the local population in administration and decision-making processes, and promoted local responsibility and development, but at the same time remained subordinate to the influence of the central power. Reforms have also been implemented in the military sector. The army has been modernized, service hours shortened, training and organization improved to increase the effectiveness of the armed forces. These reforms were necessary because the Crimean Wars, 1853 to 1856, had highlighted Russia's military backwardness. A modern army was crucial for securing territory, controlling the vast empire, and deterring foreign powers. Economically, Alexander II fostered infrastructure projects, industrialization, and trade. Railway networks have been massively expanded to improve transport, communications, and military mobility. Factories, mines, and new industries sprang up, especially in urban centers and strategically important regions. This economic modernization was closely linked to social reform, as it created jobs, facilitated trade and production, and formed the basis for a growing middle class. Despite these far-reaching reforms, the autocracy remained strong. The Tsar retained control over the central administration, the military, and the church. Opposition movements, some of which emerged from the educated elite, were monitored, censored, or suppressed. Reforms were deliberately designed to promote stability and loyalty while at the same time leaving central power untouched. To sum up, Alexander II's reforms were a balancing act between modernization and autocracy. Peasants' liberation, judicial reforms, local self-government, military modernization, and economic development strengthened Russia structurally and socially without calling into question the sovereign power of the Tsar. These reforms laid the foundation for modern Russia, but also led to new social and political tensions that challenged the monarchy in the late 19th and early 20th century. In the next chapter, we will analyze the reign of Nicholas II and the end of the Russian monarchy, the Revolution of 1905, World War I, political and social tensions that eventually led to the overthrow of the last Tsar.
Chapter 19. Tsar Nicholas II and the End of the Monarchy. The reign of Nicholas II, 1894 to 1917, marked the end of the centuries-long Russian monarchy. He took the throne at a time of enormous social, economic, and political tensions. Despite his firm belief in the sovereign power of the Tsar, Nicholas II was unable to implement reforms quickly or effectively, which led to growing popular discontent and ultimately the Revolution of 1917. Nicholas II took over a Russia that was modernizing economically but was deeply divided socially. Industrialization, urbanization, and railroad construction had given rise to new social groups, workers, intellectuals, and a growing middle class, who increasingly demanded political participation. At the same time, the majority of the population remained rooted in agriculture and serfdom-like conditions, especially in remote regions, which exacerbated social inequality. The first major political tensions occurred during the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Russia's defeat led to national demoralization, economic strain, and growing discontent. The defeat exposed military and administrative backwardness, while the costs of the war increased the burden on peasants and workers. This crisis culminated in the Revolution of 1905, triggered by Bloody Sunday, a massacre of peaceful demonstrators in St. Petersburg who delivered a petition for reforms. The revolution led to strikes, uprisings, peasant revolts, and the establishment of workers' councils, Soviets, which were the first forms of organized oppositional self-management. Despite the introduction of the October Manifesto, which promised civil rights and established a parliament, the Duma, Nicholas II retained control of the military, administration, and police. The reforms were insufficient and contributed only to limited stabilization. In everyday life, the population continued to suffer from poverty, oppression, and a lack of political participation. Working conditions in cities were harsh, peasants were given limited economic rights, and political opposition was monitored or persecuted. The discrepancy between autocratic rule and the demands of the population grew steadily. Russia's entry into the First World War, 1914 to 1918, drastically exacerbated the crisis.
Military defeats, supply crises, rising prices, and food shortages led to massive discontent. The conduct of the war by Nicholas II and the influence of his wife Alexandra on political decisions further weakened confidence in the Tsarist rule. The autocratic system was unable to cope with the enormous burdens of war, economic crisis, and social unrest. The February Revolution of 1917 was the result of these cumulative crises. Worker strikes, demonstrations, and mutinies led to the dissolution of the imperial administration. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, ending the 300-year reign of the Romanov dynasty. The monarchy was replaced by a provisional government, while political, social, and military power struggles led the country into the October Revolution and Civil War. In summary, the reign of Nicholas II shows the end of traditional autocracy in Russia. Political incompetence, social inequality, economic burdens, and military defeats led to growing opposition. Despite reforms such as the Duma, the Tsarist power was no longer able to control tensions. The end of the monarchy was thus the result of centuries of structural problems, a lack of modernization, and the inability to react appropriately to social changes. In the next chapter, we will analyze the legacy of the Russian monarchy, how political, social, and cultural developments of the past centuries shaped the Russian Federation and post-revolutionary society.
Chapter 20. Legacy of the Russian monarchy. The Russian monarchy left behind a multi-layered, enduring legacy that continues to shape Russia's political, social, economic, and cultural structures to the present day. Over almost 1,000 years, the various dynasties, from the Rurikids to the Romanovs to Nicholas II, developed a system of autocratic rule that combined centralized power, social hierarchies, and territorial expansion. This legacy influences not only Russia's political culture, but also its identity and social structure. Politically, the defining element was the strong central power of the Tsar. Autocratic rule established mechanisms that allowed control over a vast and heterogeneous territory. Bureaucracy, administration, military, and church were closely linked, creating a stable, albeit rigid power structure. Even after the fall of Nicholas II, many administrative traditions, military structures, and principles of centralization were retained in the Soviet and later Russian administration. The monarchy also left a territorial legacy. Russia developed into one of the largest countries in the world, encompassing Europe, Asia, and the Far East. Expansion, border security, and integration of a wide variety of peoples led to a multi-ethnic empire whose political administration, culture, and society were geared towards the integration of heterogeneous groups. Many territorial and cultural tensions that were evident in the Soviet era and in today's Russia have their roots in this phase. Socially, the Russian monarchy was characterized by strict hierarchies and social differentiation. The nobility, clergy, urban middle class, and peasants formed a hierarchical system that enabled political stability but also generated social tensions. Reforms, such as the emancipation of the peasants under Alexander II, changed the foundations, but centuries of social inequality continued to have an impact and influenced political and social movements of the 20th century. Culturally and intellectually, the monarchy left behind a rich legacy. Art, architecture, literature, music, education, and science were systematically promoted under Tsars such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Russia developed a hybrid culture that combined European influences with indigenous traditions. Academies, universities, theaters, and museums created not only cultural centers, but also institutions that imparted knowledge, identity, and political loyalty. This legacy had a lasting impact on the Russian intelligentsia, culture, and education. Religiously, the connection between the Orthodox Church and the state was a defining feature. The Church legitimized the Tsarist rule, conveyed social norms, and contributed to the stability of the empire. Even after the revolution, the Orthodox tradition remained culturally and symbolically effective, even in times of political oppression or secularization. After all, the Russian monarchy left behind institutional and ideological patterns that influenced political thought into the 20th century.
Centralization, bureaucracy, autocratic power, administration, and military organization shaped both the Tsarist and Soviet state structures. At the same time, the history of reforms, uprisings, and revolutions left behind an awareness of social justice, political participation, and concentration of power. In summary, the legacy of the Russian monarchy is multi-layered and ambivalent. It created central power structures, promoted culture and education, shaped territory and administration, and laid the foundations for Russia's political, social, and economic development. At the same time, it left behind inequalities, tensions, and autocratic traditions that determined the challenges for modernity. The end of the monarchy in 1917 was not the end of its impact. Many of its structures, ideas, and institutions continue to have an impact today and have a lasting impact on Russian society and politics.